Thank you guys for coming, and for those watching upstairs, I'm Bob Hamilton. We just came out of Eurasia Regional Studies Program classes this morning, and I've been talking about war all morning. This morning was Ukraine and Moldova, and now it's Syria, the one common denominator, Russia. And so I entitled this Russia and the U.S. in Syria, or another version I had entitled Syria between Russia and the U.S. More accurately, you might call it Syria among Russia, the U.S., Turkey, Iran, Israel, ISIS, HTS, Jordan. Am I forgetting anybody? China, yeah, they're probably there too. Now, the point is there are a lot of players. There are a lot of, both internally, inside of Syria, and externally, there are a lot of actors involved in this, what started as a civil war and hopefully will end and not escalate to a regional great power war in Syria. So what I want to talk about a little bit is background, so how I came to kind of be involved with Syria, and then talk about the U.S.-Russian deconfliction effort in Syria, both the history of it and how we do it, what the process is. Talk about what I think are Russia's goals, tactics, methods, ends, ways, means in Syria, why they're there, what they're doing to achieve their objectives. A very little bit about the performance of the Russian military in Syria, the remaining challenges for them, some of which we may have just simplified, and then what does the U.S. withdrawal mean, and some of the critiques of it and how I would kind of maybe respond to those critiques or assess them. So 2 snapshots in time, and I'll go through this really quickly. Summer of 2016 was kind of at the height of the U.S.-Russian joint effort in Geneva to implement and oversee the ceasefire that the UN Security Council resolution passed earlier that year had put in place. Pretty early in that effort, they identified the need for Russia speakers and specialists. They had plenty of Mideast specialists there in Geneva. The U.S. government did, but we kept going. They would go down to the UN every morning and sit down with the Russians to talk about ceasefire monitoring and implementation. And then the U.S. group would go back up to the U.S. mission in Geneva and say, hey, the Russians just accused us of a whole bunch of things that we're not doing, and they also lied about what they're doing. So why are they doing this? And so as this went on, they identified a need to bring a Russia person in. So they started rotating Eurasian foreign area officers through Geneva on kind of 1-ish month rotations throughout the summer and fall of 2016 until that whole process kind of fell apart in the fall of 2016 with the attack on eastern Aleppo by Russia and the regime. And then summer and fall of 2017, we stood up a ground deconfliction cell for Syria inside the CJTF OIR headquarters. We had been running deconfliction out of the air headquarters in Al Udeid, but as Russian and U.S. forces came closer and closer to each other on the ground in Syria, the 3-star headquarters in Kuwait and Iraq identified a need to stand up a Russian ground deconfliction cell. So I happened to be available meaning he's at the Army War College, so we can't really be doing anything that important. And so I was sent over there along with 4 interpreters to stand this cell up and run it for a couple of months until the YS system kicked into gear, the individual augmentation system in the Army kicked into gear, and they were able to find a replacement. And so guys have been over there, are currently still over there. We have an 06 Army Foreign Area Officer running this cell that does deconfliction on the ground with the Russians in Syria. So real quickly on the Geneva process, as I said, there was a Security Council resolution passed in early 2016. It called for a ceasefire, humanitarian assistance, access, and negotiations on a political transition. It never really went anywhere because the Russians and the Syrian regime, by that time, I think, understood that they had the potential, at least in central and in western Syria, to win a military victory. And so they weren't really interested in monitoring and implementing a ceasefire. They were interested in the ceasefire having many of the opposition groups to the Syrian regime, some of which were US-backed, stand down, which just made them easier targets to attack. So this process, I think it actually still exists formally, but it's not having a significant effect. My sense is it's not having a significant effect on the potential to actually end the conflict. There's a parallel process the Russians are in charge of called the Astana process. Because it got started in Astana, Kazakhstan, the Russians, the Iranians, the regime, and the Turks are the leaders of that process. That is, I think, a process that the Russians believe has a better chance of ending the war on terms that they like than the Geneva process. But what the Geneva process consisted of was periodic meetings kind of at the ambassadorial level, in the International Syria Support Group, which was a collection of about 30 to 32, it varied over time, states and international organizations that would meet at the UN in Geneva and discuss the future of Syria. There were 2 weekly meetings, one called the Ceasefire Task Force, one called the HA Task Force that dealt with ceasefire and humanitarian assistance oversight. There were daily meetings down here. This is kind of what I was doing between the US mission to the UN and the Russian mission to the UN in Geneva. We would meet every day at 10 o'clock at the UN building to talk about ceasefire implementation. And this is where the Russians would hand us their list of 10 or 12 accusations of things that we allegedly were doing, generally none of which were true, some of which were so egregious that we felt like we had to respond to. And so this really just became a forum for accusations, and there was not a lot of actual implementation of ceasefire going on. There was another channel between our ambassador, whose portfolio covered Syria, but he was in Amman, Jordan, and the Russian military headquarters at Hmeimim, Syria. We and the Russians would come back to the UN every day at 3 p.m. and sit in on that call between Dick Hoagland, who was our ambassador at the time with responsibility for Syria, and the Russian 3-star in Hmeimim. There was an idea maybe for the US and Russia to stand up a joint targeting group to jointly target ISIL and what at the time was calling itself Al-Nusra Front, now calls itself HDS. It's the kind of Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, although they've divorced themselves. They're not part of the franchise anymore. That never went anywhere, mostly because when eastern Aleppo fell, most of the eastern Aleppo was controlled by the opposition to the Assad regime. It was the target of a deliberate military operation during the ceasefire by the Russians and the regime. Some of the groups in there were backed by the US, others were jihadist groups. When it fell, the US more or less pulled out of this idea to establish a joint targeting group with the Russians. You got to have an org chart, right? So this is here's where OIR sits. A lot of you know this, I'm sure. OIR sits under CENTCOM, and they have a CJ flick, and then they have a SAGITF. The SAGITF is divided into Syria and Iraq commands. The deconfliction process kind of worked like this. So we sat under the J3. We had daily contact with the SAGITF in Syria, the guys who were embedded with the Syrian Democratic Forces, with the US partner force in Syria, daily contact with what they call the Russia Analysis Cell at the air headquarters in Qatar. And this was, like I said, daily phone calls, emails with the SAGITF, since they were their headquarters at least was co-located, face-to-face meetings to try to ensure that we understood, especially here, that the Russians weren't able to put daylight between these 2 groups, between the air and ground deconfliction efforts. Since the US side, we weren't co-located, they were. So their air and ground deconfliction cells were really the same cell at Hmeimim, and they would always try to put daylight between the air side and the ground side, or to just kind of induce chaos or confusion between the 2 deconfliction efforts on the US side. So this was a whole lot of, I had an 06 counterpart at LUD that I talked to 3 or 4 times a day probably. They did air deconfliction again with the Russians. We did ground deconfliction. And what does the ground deconfliction look like? So first of all, why do we call it deconfliction? We call it deconfliction because in the National Defense Authorization Act, I guess this would have been NDAA for 16 and then renewed for 17. There's language in there, and I think still today, that says the United States military is prohibited from conducting coordinated or cooperative operations with the Russian Federation, right? So we were by law prohibited from cooperating or coordinating our operations with those of the Russians. which sometimes put us in a difficult situation. Because there were times when you needed the Russians to know where U.S. forces or U.S.-backed forces would be. And so the question was always, you know, for the lawyers, are we coordinating our operations now? And so the lawyers came up with a term called advanced deconfliction, which said, no, you're not coordinating. If you're telling them where you're going to be and they have to stay out of there, that's not coordination, that's advanced deconfliction. So the origins of the ground cell was what we used to call the Nearmiss at Atanf. Atanf is here in southern Syria. We still have a garrison there, may not for much longer. In June of 2017, the Russians had given us 48 hours to vacate Atanf. They've wanted us out of there for a long time for a lot of reasons I won't get into, but they sent a new 3-star in, and in his first call with General Townsend, who was the U.S. commander at the time, he said, you got 48 hours to get out of Atanf. General Townsend said, look, you know, we're there for good reasons. We're not going to get out of Atanf, and this is something we can discuss later. In a later call, a couple of days later, the Russian general said, I told you, 44 hours ago that you had 48 hours to get out of Atanf. You now have 4 hours. Or words to the effect of, my forces will do what needs to be done. And General Townsend said, are you threatening my forces? Because if you're threatening my forces, this call is over, because I'm going to hang up and I'm going to call my commander there and tell him to defend himself. Because we will defend our forces. So are we going to talk or are we going to fight? And the Russian said, the tape of this is fantastic, because it was interpreted by an Air Force E-4 on the night shift at Al-Udeid. This is why there's a ground deconfliction cell in Syria now, because this kid did a great job, but he was interpreting almost the start of a war between the Russian Federation and the United States. And the Russian general said, well, I'm for talking, but we still want you to leave Atanf. And so the call ended. At that point, General Townsend kind of put an email together that said, look, this just happened. KAOC has done a great job with this, but I need my own deconfliction cell that has kind of more senior leadership, that has 24/7 coverage. We can't afford for this to happen again. So that's really the origins of the ground deconfliction cell. Email and phone calls. Sometimes the phone calls were admin stuff, testing the line or whatever. We used a standalone laptop with a Gmail account. They used their mod.ru email accounts, which always kind of surprised me. But we, like I said, we had a commercial internet line, standalone laptop, hooked to nothing else, because you're emailing the Russian military. We didn't use any of our own accounts or any computers hooked into the NIPRNet or anything. The periodicity and level, 3-star tended to be every few weeks to every month, or when there was a crisis. 1-star at the J3 level, every couple of weeks or as required. And then CHOPS would be weekly or a couple of times a week, and then at the cell, at the Russian deconfliction cell, it was daily for us, either emails or phone calls, things like that. What did they talk about? What are they talking about now? What did we talk about? Deconfliction zone proposals, right? So we would say, we would always say, and we had an agreement from earlier in the summer of 2017, that the Euphrates was the deconfliction line. And the Russians kept trying to revise that and modify that. So there were a lot of proposals going back and forth. Strike notifications when either we or they were going to strike, where we thought we saw ISIS. We would put a strike box down. They would do the same thing. And then the other side would either deconflict or not. Either say, yes, we deconflict, meaning you can strike, or no, we do not deconflict. Sometimes they would say we do not deconflict because we have forces in the area, or sometimes they would just say we don't deconflict, and you wouldn't know why. And then when there were incidents, de-escalation of those incidents. While I was there, at least, the greatest escalation was in the middle of the month in September 2017, when the Russians and the regime had this operation to liberate Deir ez-Zor. Deir ez-Zor there were a couple of Syrian regime garrisons in Deir ez-Zor. It had been they'd been surrounded by ISIS for 3 years. And this was for the Assad regime, for the Russians, it was a big deal from a public relations standpoint and from a military standpoint to get to Deir ez-Zor, relieve those garrisons. The Russians had embedded reporters with them. We saw a video that played on Russian TV, 48 hours after they got to Deir ez-Zor, it was on television. It was actually really well done. It was, the race across the desert, fighting ISIS all the way, surrounding Deir ez-Zor, reducing it, liberating the garrisons. But they also were determined that they needed to be on the east side of the river too, what we call our side of the river. And so they would periodically put these big de-escalation zones on the US side of the river. One of them, the first one was 30 kilometers deep by 130 kilometers long down the river. And so you guys have to stay out of there because we need to be on that side of the river in order to liberate Deir ez-Zor. We have to invest it from both sides. And so we kept going back to the rivers of deconfliction line because that was the agreement that we had come to. We had a map. We had tape of their general agreeing to it. They then claimed that they had never agreed to that. At that point, it's useless to play the tape for them because they'll just say you made that tape up or you doctored it or whatever. So we just continued to discuss where the actual deconfliction line was. They would strike on our side of the river, on the U.S. side of the river, sometimes to make points, especially after in early September when the SDF, the U.S. partner force, started its operation. So they had been busy clearing Raqqa when the Raqqa operation looked like it was kind of in its end stages, and the SDF could free up enough manpower to move down here on the east bank of the Euphrates and clear ISIS out of this region. They started an operation in early September to do that. The Russians kept bombing right in front of them or sometimes on top of them, I think to try to deter us and them from moving farther down the river. Okay. So why did Russia intervene in Syria? Again, this is Bob's take on this. There are other people who will disagree with me. That's fine. I think the immediate issue was to prevent the fall of the Assad regime. In the summer of 2015, it looked like the Assad regime was on its last legs. The opposition was going to win. You had senior military people defecting from the Assad regime to the Free Syrian Army and other groups, and it really looked like they were about to lose Syria, which was one of the two pillars of their strategy in the Middle East. Iran is the other. And then for the Russians, what they kind of lumped together as the terrorists or the Sunni opposition to the Assad regime, kind of the same people that have threatened Russia from the early days of Chechnya on. A lot of the attacks inside of Russia have been from Sunni groups that the Russians will argue are all in cahoots with, allied with these other groups, right? So I actually think I have this backwards. I think target number one was the moderate Sunni opposition backed by the United States because that was the only opposition that really had the potential to overthrow the Assad regime. Target number two was probably the al-Nusra Front. Target number three was ISIS. ISIS was the long-term problem that they could take care of once they had eliminated the US-backed Sunni opposition that actually had the potential to overthrow Assad. Longer term, I think it was about stabilization or improving its position in the Middle East, forcing the United States to reckon with Russia as a player in the Middle East. Be taken seriously as a global power. This is power projection, right? This whole, I'll talk about this in a minute, but the deployment of the Kuznetsov, the Russian aircraft carrier, was about, yeah, I know Parker's laughing. There are good reasons to laugh. Unless you happen to be a pilot flying off the Kuznetsov, then it's not so funny. But they wanted to show that they could project power outside of what they call their near abroad, right? The countries directly bordering Russia. And then, and this is a real thing, this is not just Russian propaganda, they will draw a straight line from the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003 to the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004 to the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005 to the Arab Spring movements to the Maidan revolution in Ukraine in late 2013, early 2014, and say the United States and specifically the CIA is behind every one of these. These are not people power movements that rise up and overthrow authoritarian, corrupt regimes. These are coups orchestrated by the US intelligence services designed to overthrow governments friendly to Russia. They saw that happening in Syria. They had seen it happening, they claimed the same thing happened in Libya. And so they were determined, they had an opportunity and decided to take a stand against this. What do they do? So what are their ways, I guess you could say? One of the things they started to do, about the time I got there, in the summer of 2017, was argue that, hey, you guys aren't here legally. You're not in Syria legally. We are, because we've been invited in by the legitimate Syrian government. The United States is intervening in a sovereign country without the permission of its government. The irony of that, right, coming from the country that invaded Georgia and Ukraine and everything, but nevertheless, they have, as ISIS becomes no more as a caliphate, our argument for staying in Syria gets a little dicier from a legal perspective. We based it on two things. One was Article 51 of the UN Charter, self-defense, right? Which basically says that if you're being attacked from inside another state, and that state either is unwilling or unable to prevent it, you have a right under international law to intervene to prevent further attacks. And so most of the ISIS attacks, ISIS-claimed attacks on regional and our European allies that were happening in 2014, 2015, 2016 were planned and directed out of Syria, mostly a few cities in the southern Euphrates River Valley. So the Article 51 justification is one. The other is a request by the Iraqi government, a partner of the United States, that said, hey, we're being attacked from across the Syrian border by ISIS. Can you help us by going in and eliminating the ISIS threat in Syria? So our legal justification for being there, the Russians know this, is entirely founded on ISIS. The other thing they would do is try to sideline the US and UN in the peace process. That's what this whole Astana process is about, and I talked about that earlier. The Russians don't like the UN plan, so they're guarantors of it, they're signatories to it. They and the US are co-chairs of the group that's supposed to implement it, but they don't like it primarily because it calls for free and fair elections within 14 to 18 months of a ceasefire. The Russians are familiar with the ethnic and sectarian demographics of Syria, right? They can go to the CIA World Factbook just as easily as any of us can and see that Syria is 74% Sunni, some Arabs, Sunni Arabs, some Kurds, but nevertheless, the regime that's currently in power, that's allied to Russia, is a minority regime, mostly Alawite Shia and also some of the other religious and ethnic minorities. But a Syria that has free and fair elections, if those are even possible in the aftermath of a war like this, let's assume they are, is not going to elect a government that's allied to Russia. It's going to elect a government that's has a lot of antagonism toward Russia. And so Russia stands to lose in free and fair elections, one of the pillars of its strategy in the Middle East. The other thing, and I don't think they're wrong, is they don't believe you can have free and fair elections in the aftermath of a war that's killed well over 400,000 people, that's displaced over 10 million, that's been fought on ethnic and sectarian grounds, that's drawn in most of the regional powers. So their question to us a lot, especially in Geneva, is, so how do you organize free and fair elections in the 14 months after that war ends? And to be honest, we didn't have a very good answer for it. So I don't think that they're wrong that the UN plan, as it's currently written, without a significant international peacekeeping presence that no country right now, except for Russia, has the stomach for, and a significant international oversight, I think Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1995, they're not wrong that the UN plan is likely a plan that's going to end in renewed chaos and civil war. There's a huge Russian disinformation campaign about US support to ISIS. It's everywhere. I've got a slide. The next slide kind of shows an example of it. They would strike the SDF, sometimes dirt strike right in front of them to deter them from moving. Sometimes, and I'm not sure if this was intentional or not, a couple of times while I was there and then since, they've hit them. Luckily, there were no US forces directly embedded with them when they hit them. And I say luckily, only not that SDF lives are any less valuable than American lives, but if you kill an American soft guy embedded with the SDF, from our perspective, that creates an entirely different problem than wounding SDF guys, which is what they did. Luckily, they didn't kill any SDF guys. No, they did. They killed some accidentally, I do believe, near the end of my time there. And then these land grabs east of the Euphrates, crossing the river, grabbing territory, saying that the deconfliction agreement that we had is no longer valid. These are all the ways that they were trying to achieve their objectives and really sideline the United States in Syria. This is probably the best known kind of Russian disinformation. Many of you guys have probably seen this. So this is the one that came out on the Russian MOD website and also on their Twitter and Facebook feeds, it said, hey, look, here's a US vehicle leading ISIS fighters out of Abu Kamal, which is in southern Syria, across the Iraqi border to safety. And then somebody said, hey, look, that looks a whole lot like that AC-130 gunship simulator game that I used to play. And so this came out, and the Russians said, yeah, that's right. That's where that picture came from. That was a mistake. The U.S. still supports ISIS, and they just moved on, right? They're not, so when they get caught in one of these lies, they're not emotionally attached to the lie because they spew so many of these that it doesn't cost them anything. And they're not actually trying to get you to believe that the U.S. is leading ISIS vehicles out of Abu Kamal. They're trying to get people to say, you know what, there's so much bad information out there, I don't know what's true. So maybe the U.S. supports ISIS, but maybe not, I don't know. And so they're just trying to muddy the information space and make it cloudy enough that nobody can take any definitive action or have any definitive opinion about what's objective fact in Syria. Okay, what did they do well? The Syrian Express was what they call the commercial. So they don't have a lot of military sea lift. We don't either, really, by the way. But they did a really good job very quickly of leveraging commercial sea lift, mostly through the Black Sea and the Bosporus and then the Eastern Med into Syria. They sustained a sortie rate that I think we're frankly too risk averse to sustain the sortie rate over time that they did. When you looked at the number of aircraft they had on the ground in Nearmiss, and the number of sorties a day that they were flying over, and they would surge at times, but I just mean a baseline sortie rate that they could not have been doing the type of maintenance on airframes or giving the rest to the pilots that in the West I think we would insist upon. But they sustained it over time, and they've sustained it with acceptable losses from their perspective. So I think they've done a pretty credible job of that. The long-range bomber sorties out of Russia, they would launch bombers from Russia, overfly Iran and Iraq, strike Syria, and then go back. So they're in the same way that, you know, sending the Kuznetsov to the Eastern Med, they're showing they can strike places, or they can influence, they can intervene in places that are not contiguous with Russia or even all that close to Russia. So that's a capability they demonstrated. Shortcomings, naval power projection and naval aviation. So you guys remember when the Turks shot down that Russian Su-24, I think it was. And there was a joke, Russian like macabre humor is fantastic. So when first of all, the Kuznetsov, it made it there, but it was not clear it was going to make it there the whole time. I mean, it limped in to its station off the Syrian coast in the Eastern Med, and in the first week of doing kind of launch and recovery operations, they lost 2 planes. And so what they finally did was just take the whole contingent and fly it on shore and base it out of Nearmiss and then have it fly out of there rather than launch and recover off the Kuznetsov because they lost 2 planes in a week. So the joke in the Russian military was the Kuznetsov has killed more Russian pilots than the Turks. I said their dark humor is really good. Not a lot of PGMs, and the ones that they use were not as precise as kind of their Western counterparts. They never were really able to leverage their amphibious landing fleet. They tried really unopposed and still couldn't pull off some of the amphibious landings that they tried to do in a credible way. But what did they gain experience in? These are things that Russia really has not had a lot of experience in the post-Soviet war period. Managing a coalition. So we look at their coalition, and to us it looks like a police lineup, right? It's Assad and Hezbollah and the Iranians and all these, you know, bad actors that we wouldn't want to be associated with. But nevertheless, for them, it's an international coalition, right? It's at least 2 other governments, the Syrian and Iranian governments. It's several different allied militia groups and what we label terrorist organizations. And they've had to cobble this coalition together, get it all moving in the same direction, manage all the competing claims and competing objectives of their coalition partners in a way that before this they really had not had to do. Working with indigenous forces inside of Syria, so this, whatever you want to call it, foreign internal defense, train and equip. They've been doing a lot of that with some of their local partners inside of Syria, because it's not only the Syrian regime, but there are a lot of militias allied with the Syrian regime, loosely affiliated with the Syrian government and the Syrian Arab army, but not directly part of it. The Russians have gained a lot of experience in training these guys, equipping them, directing their operations, integrating their operations with their other coalition partners. RPAs, in a way that both Ukraine and Syria recently, they've gotten much, much better at RPA employment than they were, for instance, in 2008 in Georgia, where it was a real mess. And then precision strike with non-precision munitions. So one of the shortcomings I identified was PGMs. They've gotten pretty good at dropping dumb bombs very close to where they need to be. But these are still things that for them are still major shortcomings when compared to a Western, say a NATO military. Okay. So this is, again, what do I think? You'll read a lot that, hey, Russia and the Assad regime have won. It's time for the US to acknowledge that the regime has won, Russia's won. Time for us to get out and let them handle the aftermath, right? Let them handle the reconstruction and governance and all those challenges that come with the end of a conflict. We don't really have any critical national interests or vital interests there, so let's cut bait, let the Russians handle it. Whatever you think of the second part of that, I actually think they haven't won yet. There's three major geographic challenges that they were going to have to deal with, two of which we have a vote in, but all three of which are going to be difficult for them to resolve. The first is Idlib, which this is, by the way, I was talking in a seminar today. Some of you guys are in my Eurasia seminar. The live UA map, which live UA is for universal awareness. It's this essentially crowdsourced conflict map. They do Syria, they do ISIS in Syria and Iraq, they do Ukraine, they do several other conflicts. But it kind of shows who controls what, and it pulls in the Facebook and Twitter feeds and official PAO press releases and announcements from all the combatants in a conflict. It corroborates them if it can. It then puts them on the map in an icon, for instance. So, and then it shows who controls what. So red is the Assad regime and its allies. Yellow is the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish and Sunni Arab coalition backed by the United States. Green is moderate opposition. This is Entente. This is the garrison at Entente. There's a single remaining US-backed opposition group there that controls that area with US kind of sponsorship. You can see the rest. This used to be very much, there were all kinds of little green lily pads. If you looked at this map a year ago, and by the way, you can go back in time on the live map. But there were all sorts of green lily pads in this part of Syria a year ago, and even more 2 years ago. So they have consolidated control over much of Syria. But Idlib, which is right here, is going to be, I think it's going to be a problem for them. That's kind of what Idlib looks like up close. The reason Idlib's a problem is the strongest group there is HTS, which is the former Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. But it's become sort of a petri dish of various Sunni opposition groups that had been controlling other parts of Syria as the Russians and the regime would reduce these opposition-controlled cities from eastern Aleppo in the fall of 2016 to Homs and Hama and Dara and Daraya and all these other places that the opposition had controlled. They would bomb them, and then starve them, and then they would offer a deal, and the deal was essentially, look, we'll establish a humanitarian corridor and we'll let people out, to include fighters, with their weapons. Because they didn't want to fight house to house in these cities, and so they essentially just let the fighters evacuate, and they've been sending them all to Idlib. So these guys are all mixed up together in Idlib. And so you have HTS, you've got the Free Syrian Army, which is Turkish back there, you've got probably a dozen different other Sunni opposition groups that are all there together. And the Russians and the regime, their preference would be essentially to do to Idlib what they did to the rest of the opposition-controlled areas. Bomb it flat, cut off HA, starve it out, and then tell the fighters, either fight or you need to leave and go somewhere. The problem is that somewhere is unclear. The fear is they would go north into Turkey. And so the Turks don't want that. And the Turks also back several of the groups that are in Idlib. So what you have now is that Russians and the Turks and the Iranians and the regime have essentially declared a de-escalation zone in Idlib. You see All these little blue dots are Turkish military observation posts. The red ones are Russians in the regime, and the orange are Iranian. So in order to end the Syrian conflict, you have to deal with Idlib, and I frankly just don't think the Russians know what to do about Idlib. Again, their preference would be to treat it the way they've treated the other opposition controlled areas and essentially just destroy it. But Turkey is in the way of that. So anyway, that's something to watch. Atanf is another one. Again, we're in Atanf. I'd be lying if I said I knew how much longer we will be in Atanf. We're there doing we're doing really three things. We're protecting we call the MOT. It's a US-backed opposition group that's there. We're also protecting an IDP camp that sits right here on the Jordanian border called Rukban, and there's somewhere between 50 and 55,000 internally displaced persons there from elsewhere in Syria. The Russians have been saying, ever since I first got involved in this in the summer of 2016, Rukban's full of terrorists. We know Rukban's not full of terrorists, but we also know there are some bad guys in Rukban. Most of the people in Rukban are women and children and old men, not a fighting age, but there are fighting age males there. There are bad guys there. The reason we know that is because there was an attack. The Jordanians, for a while, were letting people across into Jordan and claim refugee status and processing them. And there was an attack on Jordanian security forces a couple of years ago now that killed 7 of them in the flow of refugees coming out of Rukban, right? So there are bad guys in Rukban. But I think the Russian, and if we leave Atanf, I think what will happen to Rukban is it'll be leveled. And what that'll cause is a huge outflow of refugees trying to get to the Jordanian border and cross it. It's closed. So then you have a humanitarian crisis. So that's reason number 2. Mott is reason number 1. Rukban's reason number 2. Reason number 3 is this is the Syria-Iraq border. Us being here complicates the Iranian infiltration of fighters, weapons, and everything else into Syria. Us being along that border. And so for those reasons, we're still in Atanf. And while we're there, the Russians and the regime will have a hard time implementing, calling the war over and implementing some sort of post-war solution. And then the third is the entire northeast of the country. It's probably a quarter of the country, maybe more, controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, the US-backed Kurdish and Sunni Arab militia. They're the ones that liberated Raqqa, which was ISIS' self-described capital in Syria. They're the ones that fought their way down the east bank of the Euphrates, grabbed all the oil infrastructure, which is really almost all the oil infrastructure left in Syria. That's why, if you remember, in February, almost a year ago, the Russian, the Wagner Group guys who struck or were going to strike the SDF and were struck by the United States, and some 200 to 300 of them were killed. That was an attempt, I think, to see if they could grab some of the oil infrastructure that's in the area, maybe make the U.S. blink, maybe make the SDF believe that the United States would not fight for them if it really came down to it. Using the Wagner Group was a way to do that so that if it went off the rails as it did, the Russian military could claim no knowledge and no sponsorship of the attack. But anyway, this is a problem as well. So if we stay, the SDF, so the Sunni Arabs in the east and the Kurds, will have some sort of role in the political process. They will have some sort of maybe limited autonomy, self-governance, something in a post-war Syria. If we leave, then maybe all that's out the window. It remains to be seen. Okay. I'll end with this. So if you read the stuff, right, so the president announced the withdrawal. He tweeted it in the middle of December. ISIS is defeated. It was the only reason for us being there, or the withdrawal starts immediately. Since then, we've had a whole bunch of people in the U.S. government running around trying to do damage control. So, NSA Bolton was in the Middle East. Secretary Pompeo was in the Middle East. There were a lot of senior U.S. government officials running around the region trying to reassure partners and allies that what the president said didn't actually mean we were withdrawing from Syria, and it didn't mean it would be right away. And even if we did withdraw from Syria, we weren't abandoning the region. So now the president has since reiterated that we're withdrawing. And there are, from people that I talked to from when I worked at OIR, there are people moving back over there now to start a retrograde. So there's something is happening. Things are coming out. Whether people actually come out, I know in Manbij, where the attack was yesterday, we had already withdrawn some of the excess equipment. But the critique is, hey, look, ISIS isn't really defeated. My response to that would be, so ISIS physical caliphate is not going to be around for much longer, right? So if you define defeat of ISIS as taking away the physical caliphate, then the administration can say, we've defeated ISIS. The problem is that's not what they said. That's what they're saying now. But that doesn't mean ISIS is defeated. It just means ISIS reverts to being a more traditional terrorist organization and does more of what it did yesterday in Manbij, only maybe it does it in, Cleveland or London or whatever, and then the administration, fairly or unfairly, is going to have to answer the question of why did you say ISIS was defeated and withdraw from Syria when ISIS clearly isn't defeated, right? They're already having to answer that question about Manbij. And nobody on, Twitter feeds and news website is interested in the debate about whether the 2,000 US troops in Syria now would have prevented an attack, a future ISIS attack somewhere, right? That's, how we consume news. We're not willing generally to get to that level of debate. A lot of it is bumper sticker. And so the administration is putting itself, I think, in a position of having to defend its actions when the next attack occurs, because there will be another attack. And it may be in Syria, it'll certainly be in Syria, it probably in regional countries, and maybe in US allied countries in Europe or in North America. The second is, well, it's a gift to the Russians, the regime in Iran. I guess my response would be, well, yeah, yes it is, but our policy in Syria should not be about making life difficult for Iran, the regime, and the Russians. It should be about finding a way to stabilize Syria inside of its internationally recognized borders, right? So that's always been our policy. We've never argued for a carving up of Syria or Kurdish independence or any of that. My sense is our policy objective should be, how do you stabilize Syria inside of its internationally recognized borders? And I think the only way to do that is some sort of limited regional autonomy for the North and East. Some sort of limited regional autonomy for the Kurds. And yes, I understand what the Turks think of that, but they've been dealing with it in Iraq in a de facto way for how many years now? For 16 years, right? They don't like it, but limited regional autonomy for the Northeast, the Kurds and the Sunni Arabs on the east side of the Euphrates. Because if you go in, if the Russians in the regime, if we withdraw and the Russians in the regime go in there and militarily subdue them, first of all, it'll be a very long, bloody campaign. And secondly, I don't think they're going to be subdued forever. They fought too long and too hard to liberate their towns and their cities from ISIS and the regime to go back under the regime thumb kind of that easily. So I think, in a way, it's a gift to Russia, the regime in Iran, but that shouldn't be what we're making policy about. We should be making policy about how to stabilize Syria and prevent the war from starting again. And the final thing is the credibility. President Obama used to say, he used to call the national security and foreign policy think tank community in DC the blob. And he used to say the blob fetishizes, we have this fetish about American credibility. Like, well, you can't do that, Mr. President, because it'll damage American credibility, to which, he, and I think Trump too, would say, yeah, and then what? So what? To me, the so what of this is there are two things, and then I'll really be done. The first thing is our model of post 9/11 warfighting has often been to use air power, SOF, and intelligence, partner with local indigenous ground forces, right? We did this in the early stages in Afghanistan. We did it in Iraq with the Sons of Iraq during the surge. We've done it again in Iraq with both the regime and with the regime. That's the Syrian word. The Iraq is the legitimate, democratically elected Iraqi government. So we've done this, and we've been doing it in Syria very effectively. So if we're seen to abandon the SDF to the regime and the Russians, I think that will make it more difficult in the future for us to fight wars along that model. In places where, so when we have vital US interests engaged, we're going to deploy US ground forces, right? There's no debate. When we have important US interests, like in Syria, but not vital, then the debate, it's a legitimate debate. Do we really want significant US ground forces fighting a land war in Syria? If the answer is no, the SDF's a great partner. The SDF is 65,000 fighters, and they fight pretty well. But if we are seen to have abandoned the SDF, in the future, that may leave us with a choice between doing nothing and kind of ceding our interests because we can't find a local partner to fight with, or deploying ground forces to a conflict that we may not have vital interests at stake in. And again, that's debatable. And then, so the final thing, final reason why I think credibility matters is just the presence of the US in this conflict, I would argue. Just 2,000 US forces in Syria has a chilling effect or a tamping down effect on escalation or self-help or pursuit of their own agendas by other regional states or other regional actors. So if the US is seen to say, we have no stake in Syria, you know, let it turn out how it'll turn out, there are countries like Israel, Turkey, Iran, Jordan, other regional actors that may say either, oh good, the US is not involved, now I can pursue my agenda without the risk of coming into conflict with the US, or, oh no, the US is not involved, and the US was really kind of my principle in this. They were pursuing interests that are aligned with mine. Now I have to pursue my own interests. I have to do it myself. And maybe an analog of what might that look like is the Saudi campaign in Yemen, right, which is in the news a lot lately. The US is not involved in that in any way other than assistance, selling weapons to the Saudis, but we're not involved in terms of physically being in that conflict. Well, that conflict is seen as an anti-model for, you know, a just war or a legal war, at least in the press. And again, you can argue that. But so that's how I would respond to this credibility. So no, we should not focus and fixate on credibility for credibility's sake, but we should ask ourselves, what might be the kind of downstream or knock-on effects of damaged US credibility? So with that, I'll end it, and I'm happy to take your questions. Sir.
Sir, Jim Carmichael. Question reference authorities. You stated there earlier in the conversation that the reason why we're there is because of ISIS. If ISIS is not such a threat, and if the French have taken on more of an aggressive role against ISIS than the US, then what authorities do we have to be there? And the second question is what funding underneath the authorities line does OIR have to operate in Syria? How are they paying for it?
So the authorities, so I have no idea on the second one, because I never got involved in the money part. I don't know if OIR is still funded with what we used to call OCO. I assume it is, or whether it's funded out of the base budget. I just don't know. Thank God I never had to deal with money while I was there. The authorities piece, though, you've hit on, and I kind of think I intimated this, you've hit on a problem for us. As the ISIS physical caliphate shrinks and eventually goes away altogether, our legal justification for being in Syria then becomes less and less tenable. And you know, for what it's worth, the lawyers at OIR and CENTCOM and OSD are aware of this. They've been aware of it since the summer of 2017. I can't tell you, to be honest, what legal justification we'll espouse after that, other than you could say, well, look, it's not just the physical caliphate. So the Article 51 self-defense argument is because the attacks in, some of the attacks in Europe, right? It was at Nice, I think, in France, and there were a couple others in Europe in like 2015, 16. Those were planned and directed out of Mayadin and Abu Kamal, Syria. We know this, right? And so you could make an argument that as long as ISIS leadership cells are still there, and we know that they're still there, and they're planning and directing attacks against our allies, there's an Article 51 justification to be there, even without a physical caliphate. I assume we'll make that argument. I don't know how it'll hold up legally, to be honest with you. And I just don't know, because I'm not a lawyer either, thank God. Not a money guy, not a lawyer. Other questions? Oh, sorry.
Lieutenant Colchago from Albania. week ago, Secretary Pompeo, during his visit in Cairo, he declared that U.S. would work through diplomacy and partners to expel every boots of Iranian in Syria. And how? And who are those partners? Is Turkey one of them, for example?
So the question is, how will we ensure that Iran withdraws its forces from Syria if we're not physically there, right? We'll work through regional partners. And that, yeah, and that's what Secretary Pompeo said, right? Well, that's a good question. Diplomacy, I would say that diplomacy not backed by the credible threat of military force doesn't have a very good track record in the Syrian civil war, right? So we could say, look, we're right next door in Iraq, and we can come back to Syria anytime we please. The problem is you may not be coming back to a permissive environment like it was in, when we first went into eastern Syria. So I actually think it's a problem. And again, the administration and the U.S. administration has been saying this over and over and over. Just because we're withdrawing 2,000 troops from Syria does not mean that we're withdrawing from the region. We're still going to have forces in Iraq, but it certainly sends a signal about how we define our interests in the Syrian civil war. And as long as I've been involved in this and studying it, one of the major kind of objectives of the U.S. presence in Syria was to, I don't know how we word this, but it was defeat or degrade or prevent malign Iranian influence. Right? That's been an objective from the start. So I don't frankly know how you do that. That the Atanf garrison along the Iraq-Syria-Jordan border is a way we do that. Having a partnership with the Syrian Democratic Forces that control the whole northeastern part of Syria is another way we do that. That complicates. So Iran has this idea, whether it's official policy or just or not, of this Shia crescent, right, from Tehran stretching through Iraq, Syria, and into all the way down to Beirut, right? And so there's this idea that Iraq is already fairly friendly ground for them. If they can make Syria friendly ground as well, they have a relationship with, they have Lebanese Hezbollah, and so that kind of completes the Shia crescent idea. Well, that to a lot of our regional partners is a huge security threat. The idea of a zone of Iranian influence all the way from Tehran to Beirut. And so I don't have a good answer to your question, other than I think we're putting at risk some of our objectives. Sir.
Hey, Todd Johnston, DA Civilian, Seminar 6. How do we define the defeat of ISIS?
Yeah, so what do we actually say? So I think we first said annihilate ISIS. Annihilate ISIS was the word the president used, right? And so I happened to be in Afghanistan from February to May of 17 on a little mini deployment out of here just to fill a gap in one of the headquarters there. And so in Afghanistan, they were dealing with ISIS-K, right? ISIS Khorasan province, which is in eastern part of Afghanistan. And they were actually going through a staff exercise to try to determine what's the military objective that corresponds to annihilate. How do you annihilate ISIS? But so what I think the president meant when he said that is end the physical caliphate in Syria, destroy the affiliate in Afghanistan. That was the one we dropped the mother of all bombs on in Afghanistan. We dropped it on a mountaintop where some of those guys allegedly were. And then the Russians said, we have a much bigger bomb. It's called the father of all bombs. That's true. They actually said that. Because whatever we have, they have to have something that's either bigger, heavier, or better. So how do you define, how do you define defeat a terrorist group? The biggest favor ISIS ever did was declare a physical caliphate, right, and say, we're a state, come get us, right? So the physical caliphate will be no more soon. I mean, there's a tiny sliver of land on the eastern banks of the Euphrates in far southern Syria that the SDF is still fighting, and there's a little gray triangle of mostly open desert in central Syria that's still under ISIS control. But the physical caliphate will be gone. Then I think it transitions to another one of the whatever number of jihadist groups that are targeting the West. And I think at that point it becomes an intelligence and law enforcement function more than anything else. And you have to have kind of an international coalition of partners that share intelligence and share law enforcement data to defeat it. And then you have to take the ideology on, right? Because even if your intelligence is almost perfect and your law enforcement organs are very effective, if the ideology still mobilizes people to want to blow themselves up in restaurants or walk into shopping malls and start shooting people, it's hard to defeat that definitively.
I agree 100%. One of the things you mentioned, though, was that it's not really defeated if their leaders are still planning operations somewhere in Syria, which I think is probably what frustrates the president, because that means we're never leaving.
Yeah.
And we don't really have enough forces there to push many of our objectives.
So the 2,000 forces we have there, I would argue, are maybe some of them are useful in trying to root out the final remnants of the leadership in the southern Euphrates River Valley, but they're more effective in giving the U.S., the SDF, a stake in post-war Syria and in making sure that it's not just another authoritarian regime, kind of minority authoritarian regime in Damascus that represses all the other groups in the country, because that's why the first civil war started, right? So it's likely that at some point in the future another civil war would start, or this civil war would just go on. And so our presence in Syria, I think, is more effective in ensuring a stable post-war outcome than it is in rooting out the last however many ISIS guys there are in Abu Kamal and Mayadin. So.
Not a question, but just in terms of the defeat of ISIS, what I'd always seen is described as the military defeat of ISIS. So I think there's a recognition that they're going to be able to continue to conduct a terrorist attack. What the U.S. wanted to defeat was, or deny the ability for them to seize terrain and threaten the government of Iraq, which necessarily meant conducting operations in Syria also. So it was always the military objective, right? The military defeat of ISIS, which somewhere in the last, I think, month has become the defeat of ISIS. But it's always been the military defeat of ISIS.
Yeah, I think, right, the way the U.S. military defined it. The problem was, as I said, we were wrestling with what does annihilate, what does that mean? You're right, though. It was always the physical caliphate, which, again, that's what the U.S. military is designed to do. When people seize and hold terrain and say, come get me, we're designed to come get them. And so, in a way, ISIS did us a favor by declaring a caliphate and saying, here are our borders. And so I think you're right. And in Iraq, it's essentially over. In Syria, I think it'll be over soon. We're always struggling with how do you operationalize some of the rhetoric and the tweets and all this other stuff that comes out of the White House, right? We're struggling as a Department of Defense and a military. What does that mean? What's the mission for us then? But yeah, the destruction of the physical caliphate is what I think was meant. And it's what now the administration officials have been going around saying. This is what we meant all along. So, sir.
Ken Burgess, Seminar 7. How well can Russia moderate the Assad regime's behavior? What kind of influence do they have, especially as it pertains to
that's a great question.
Post-conflict constructs?
I think more than they would admit, but less than we assume, put it that way. So when I was in Geneva, my Russian counterpart was this GRU colonel, and we would go down to the meetings, and we would complain about the Tiger Brigade doing this or doing that or violating the ceasefire, and he would go, "Hey, look, this isn't Afghanistan, where you guys control everything that the Afghans do." And I would say, "Do you think?" And he would say, "Well, no, we don't have that much control over the regime. I mean, they're independent. We're in support of them, but they're in the lead here, and so we can't really control them." And I think they have a lot more control than they would let on, because without the Russian sponsorship, the regime would have lost that war in 2015 and might lose it even today if the Russians were to say, "Hey, we're done." They're not gonna, because they have what they see, I think, as vital interests in Syria. So they have more control, I think, than they're willing to admit to us, but they certainly don't have 100% positive control. One of the things, this whole thing about them managing a coalition that they're having to deal with is they've gone along now for, what have they been there for almost 3.5 years. September 2015 they came in, telling all their coalition partners what they want to hear. Telling the Iranians this, telling Hezbollah this, telling the regime this, telling the Turks now that the Turks have been brought in. They're not part of the Russian coalition, but they're part of the Astana process. Telling everyone what they want to hear. Now they're at the point where it's going to be harder to do that because now they actually have to make some hard choices. And they're going to have to make some choices that maybe the regime doesn't like, or the Iranians don't like, or the Turks don't like, or Hezbollah doesn't like. And so I think we're going to see how much control they actually have soon. All right, well, if there are no more questions? All right, well, thank you guys.